A great pleasure again to introduce David Lahti, who, as I said yesterday, is one of these people with a PhD in philosophy of biology and also a PhD in evolutionary biology, and so really does span the two sides of the discipline, if I can put it like that. So we're very glad you're talking to us today about biology and personhood. David.
Thank you, Hilary. Well, it's probably a little bit of a nightmare that I talked your ear off until you went to bed last night, and then you wake up in the morning, and then here I am still going at it. But we'll see what we can make of it anyway. So I was asked to speak on biology and personhood, but then I noticed that I was the first lecture of the day, and so I blended it with a little bit of a general introduction to the concept of personhood too. And I left out the emergence of personhood over evolutionary time. And I think that Carol Wall-Scheffler's talk yesterday on the evolution of humans and its potential implications for religion would be a great way. If you just look at those slides or look at that transcript and think about what it would mean for personhood, I think that would be just as good as me talking about it today. I would have used a lot of the same illustrations, etc., and inferences. Anyway, we are persons, and although we don't necessarily know what that means, how would we know if we met a different kind of person? Does biology have anything to say, just since that's my field, about personhood? And that's a bunch of tough issues. I was sitting on my couch last week struggling to figure out what a person was, and my 12-year-old son, Elias, came home from his last day of school with his yearbook, where all his friends had signed, and so I took a break and looked at the notes that his friends wrote, and I saw this among them: Elias, you are a person, keep doing that. HAGS, which is have a great summer, that's what that means, man. And it's funny precisely because the personhood of a 12-year-old human being is obvious and unremarkable. And it's also automatic. Elias can't help keep doing it. But still, what is it? So today, I'll first go through some of the issues surrounding the question of what a person is. That will lead us through enough concepts that you might be in the mood just to get rid of it altogether at the end of it. And so we're going to get to reductionism after that. So if you're interested, there'll be 5 ways that people have suggested of doing just that. And then, as our notion of personhood should be general, it's appropriate to ask whether and under what circumstances might there be persons in the universe besides humans. And finally, perhaps a topic on which biology should most directly bear, but I'll give away right now that the amount that it actually has borne in public discourse at least is quite underwhelming, is the emergence of personhood in human development. All right, so this is what a person originally was, etymologically. Prosopon in Greek meant a mask, as did Latin persona, and which derived from a combination of prosopon and the Etruscan word fersu, which meant the same thing. So a mask, and then by extension, or sort of reverse synecdoche, a play actor. So the masks are coming out on stage. And then it descended through French into English as person. But how did person come to be us? Well, that was theological. That came as a surprise to me. It started with the church father Tertullian in about 200 AD, applying the Latin word persona to God's 3 persons or characters. The Greek Christian philosophers did the same thing, although they used a different word, hypostasis, which is, or hypostasis, literally like a foundational substance. So the idea was in both the Greek and Latin fathers that God had one being, one ousia, one essence, but 3 persons. And soon the word was extended to human beings because the later church fathers often used the concept or interpreted the image of God in humans as the human ability to exist as a person, as a specific, as each individual having his or her own unique identity in communion with other persons. And that concept that was used for person, even applying to humans, was hypostasis, no longer prosopon, which is more like face or countenance. And in Latin it was persona. So, and then Augustine and Boethius enlarged on this, or filled out, or tried to add content to that notion of a person by saying it was a being with a rational capacity. So that's the origin. Let's move forward to today. This is the Google engram for person, meaning the change over time in the relative representation of the word person among all the words in millions of books. From 1800 to 2008, you can see it's been well represented. And what has happened essentially is that by the way, it's relative per year, so it controls for the fact that more and more books are being published, obviously. So archaic notions of person and its plural started to fall away in the 19th century, and with the rise of biology, the term human being came onto the scene and started to take its place. But then since the 60s, we've seen a steady rise in the use of the term person, especially with political correctness, where the term man is less often used in a gender-neutral context. But personhood, on the other hand, is a new word. Today, the concept of personhood, including what makes a person, what responsibilities we have towards persons, whether there could be non-human persons, has an important place in ethics and law and philosophy, cognitive science and anthropology. This is the Google engram for personhood, and comes onto the scene in the early 60s and rises quickly to a peak around the turn of the millennium. And the reason for its rise is largely because of the abortion issue, which I will get to later. But three other matters also contributed to a lesser extent: the possibility of animal minds, extraterrestrial life, and artificial intelligence. So given the rise in importance of the concept of personhood, you'd think it'd be nice to figure out what we mean when we say that something is a person. Perhaps the place to start is ordinary language, dictionary definitions, and we'll try to weed out some inconsistencies and irrelevancies and apply biology where we can, and see where we are at that point. But this one I just present as comic relief. A person is a being, such as a human, that has certain capacities or attributes constituting personhood, which in turn is defined differently by different authors in different disciplines, by different cultures in different times and places. So, this says nothing at all, and violates the first rule. That I put banana and fruit into being a person and personhood, and it works just as well. But it violates the first rule of definitions in that you don't use the word itself in the definition if that other word directs you right back to this, and if you look up personhood, it says the quality of being a person. So anyway, I could write a dictionary of any language you like without even knowing it if that were the way you do it. But here are 8 real definitions in 5 of the most common dictionaries used in the US and in the UK. 2 online dictionaries, dictionary.com and the Google Dictionary, and then Merriam-Webster, and the 2 Oxford English dictionaries, the original one and then the shorter. So the first 2, I present these in the order that they were presented in the English language in general. The first 2 are old and already discussed. The next 2 are specific or explicitly human. And the first, the human being as an individual, and next, the personality or self of a human being. Number 5 concentrates on, it is only in the OED, and it Oxford English Dictionary, and it concentrates on the attributes of a person. It's the only commonly used definition that does that. Number 6 is archaic. Like when I say I have a wallet on my person. and it's purely derivative and has no scientific or philosophical sense to it, but nevertheless, this definition happened to be in the U.S. Constitution at this, and therefore that term, sort of ridiculously, has become the center of the entire abortion debacle in the U.S. So you can ask me about that later if you'd like. Well, actually, you can't because, well, I'm leaving right after lunch to speak elsewhere, but we can talk about it at lunch perhaps. Now, 7 is a legal definition. It's a subject of rights and duties, and it's represented also in all the law dictionaries, such as Collins and the People's Law Dictionary. And recently, in both the US and the UK and elsewhere, has engendered a debate because it was supposed to be, the legal definition was supposed to be linked with a more philosophical definition to give it some substance, but now corporations recently have been added to the definition. And in the US, foreign nations, when they're suing the US, are also added to the definition. And this means we no longer have a historical or etymological or philosophical basis for the term in law, and that could end up being a problem. And then finally, there's the grammatical category, and there's several other definitions. But if we get rid of the irrelevant ones to the philosophical issue of what is a person, we're left with these possibilities. Now, if we try to bring in the professionals now, the cognitive scientists and the philosophers who deal with personhood, they roundly dismiss the first two. And that they repudiate those because they're too anthropocentric. You don't define something by just pointing at an example of it. And so, you know, the argument goes that if extraterrestrials had the same cognitive capacities that we had and came to Earth, we would consider them persons. So as a biologist, I would have to say, I agree. Likewise, we can't use these as meaningful philosophical definitions because in order for a definition to have scientific weight, they need to be applied consistently to things by virtue of their attributes. So even if there were no persons in the entire universe except for humans, we don't want our definition to assume that from the start. So that leaves us with number 3, which, as you remember, is the only attributive definition, and it's only in the OED, and it is specified as a philosophical definition, a technical definition. So what this means is that whatever we might end up considering personhood to be, it is not likely to resemble what the public understands as personhood, and that is an unfortunate thing. So turning to philosophy now, Kant and Rousseau deliver what has become the sort of standard definition of personhood, but it is not a purely descriptive one, it's a normative definition, which means that it tells us how we ought to regard or respect persons more than it tells us what they actually are. So that's an autonomous agent, an entity with the moral right of self-determination. So this is someone who ought to be allowed to make one's own life choices. This is also the official definition of the United States National Science Foundation's Cognitive Science Mind Project. But if you accept this definition, you have to go further and ask what features are good criteria for personhood. You can't do much with a normative definition by itself. And it so happens that the lists that philosophers and cognitive scientists generally give of criteria usually include both self-consciousness and rationality, the ingredients of definition 3. So we can take those for now and move on to a list of criteria. So what kinds of attributes would any person have? Some examples that have been given in the literature are consciousness, intelligence, creativity, rationality, theory of mind, self-awareness, free will, morality, soul, and sociality or relational capacity. And the most commonly featured ones in cognitive science and philosophy are some combination of consciousness, rationality, and self-awareness. So I'll pick these 3 to talk about briefly as the last bit of groundwork. First, consciousness is the idea of an inner mental life, what Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, called the subjective character of experience. Cognitive neuroscientists have begun to study consciousness, but only through correlations between brain states, images of brain states, for instance, through fMRI, and reports by people. We don't know why the correlations exist. We don't know why consciousness is manifested by those particular brain states. And we don't have any independent way of measuring the phenomena that the subjects are reporting of their own consciousness. And there's very little indication that this situation will improve in the near future. So for the time being, we'll continue to explore, albeit with no real hypotheses, and what one might say is no true explanatory science of consciousness, at least yet. Now, the infancy of our scientific understanding of consciousness is illustrated by the diversity of opinion that even the professionals have as to what consciousness is. I'll give you two extremes. At one extreme is the cognitive scientist and philosopher Daniel Dennett, who believes that if we study these brain waves in lit up populations of neurons, we will have understood all there is to know about consciousness. And so the experiential side of things and the belief that there is something more to be explained is nothing but a confused illusion. On the other end of the spectrum is the Australian cognitive scientist and philosopher David Chalmers, who sees Dennett's response as denying the data. He says, consciousness poses the most baffling problems in the science of the mind. There's nothing that we know more intimately than conscious experience, but there's nothing that is harder to explain. We do have an inner conscious experience, as he calls it, our inner movie that needs explaining, or at least describing. He respects consciousness so much, Chalmers does, that he's proposed that it's absolutely fundamental in the universe, like space-time, mass, and electrical charge. So in other words, you can't explain it, you should start from it and construct laws to describe its dynamics and then move on from there. How different is that from Dennett, right? So with respect to personhood, whether Chalmers is wrong or right, according to our studies of animal brains and their similarity to humans, in what we might call the homologous principle, that if, to the extent that brains are similar, minds might be similar, some animals might have some degree of consciousness. So we probably can't use the existence of consciousness by itself as definitive of personhood because it's too weak. Animals might have some degree of consciousness, but they either don't have the status of persons in the way most people intuitively think of the concept, or we would need some degree of consciousness, some kind of scale to know where to put the threshold. So rationality is the second of the three aspects I want to touch on. Now this one needs some serious unpacking to find out what we mean by that. So for instance, Darwin wrote that earthworms are rational because they use little bits of leaf to cover their holes when it starts raining based on the vibration on the ground. But this doesn't mean that they thought about it. Evolution by natural selection can produce behavioral strategies that mimic the produce of thought with limited actual thought. The cool thing about rationality is that we can't anticipate the consequences of our actions and the world around us and discover solutions to entirely new problems in our head alone. So as Einstein said of general relativity, he was sure of it when he proposed it because he had already tested it in his head. It's not clear that earthworms are doing that. So surely rationality then is a continuum just like consciousness, as animals do learn and invent. Moose test the softness of the substrate beneath a pond before venturing across, attempting to predict whether they might sink into the mud beyond their depth. New Caledonian crows modify the shape of their little tools to fit into variously shaped holes in trees. And then chimps search among rocks to find the ones that are just rightly shaped, bowl-shaped, to work as a good mortar to crush seeds and rocks with. A problem in many cases is that we don't know how much of what we are seeing as behaviorists is a preset strategy and how much is being processed using this animal's free thought. Together we would consider something rationality insofar as it involves thinking. To the extent that the strategy is inherited, we would not consider it rational thought. Now, biology has so far been largely silent on rationality. except with respect to, one, a rudimentary understanding of the brain regions in which it occurs, and two, the realization that learning is, of course, widespread, but that also that there are inherited biases to probably all learning events. So thinking travels mostly along well-paved roads from our ancestry, which helps us be effective thinkers. But there is a third feature that is even more commonly used, probably the most commonly used in discussions of what would lead us to think of an entity as a person. And this is the idea that we're not only aware of external things, but we're aware of our own states, a special kind of consciousness, or it's a subset of consciousness, such that we can step back and notice ourselves and our situation. In humans, and presumably other organisms, if they had it, self-awareness, this means that we're able to critically reflect on our mental states and make judgments about them. These are called second-order beliefs and meta-beliefs. And even the nature of our existence. Why am I a human, we might ask ourselves. So it's not clear that a dog ever wonders why it is a dog. So this, of course, is a very robust degree of self-awareness. The ability to recognize oneself in a mirror, like this toddler may or may not be doing here, is considered a rudimentary form of self-awareness. 10 species have been found to have mirror self-recognition so far. Orangutans, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, although not wild gorillas, only Coco so far, I believe. Dolphins, orcas or killer whales, elephants, rhesus macaques, and magpies. Which, corvids, crows, ravens, magpies, jays are very, among the most intelligent birds. And humans, from 14 or 18 months onward. Now, the next level of self-awareness beyond mirror self-recognition would be a theory of mind, so to speak, as psychologists discuss it. In philosophy of mind, people discuss it as well. Or an ability to understand that other individuals have mental states as we do, and to act on the basis of what those mental states would be. The research on this, especially in chimps, is fascinating, but it's very difficult to test. You have to be a great experimentalist in order to figure it out, because animals might also evolve to behave as though they could interpret other animals' mental states, when in fact they're just operating according to an algorithm that doesn't require any such ability. But you can distinguish those two to some extent. So now, to what extent self-awareness, or how much of a combination of this with consciousness of other sorts and rationality and perhaps other features would be necessary in order to call an entity a person is anybody's guess. That's the problem with personhood right now from a scientific perspective. It has no empirical footing because all the supposed criteria, which were thought to be binary at one point, and you either have it or you don't, are now looking like they're all graded. They're all on a continuum. So this has led some people to talk about discussions of personhood from a reductive perspective. Now, a breach is a gap in a wall that an army can get through. So when you have a concept that becomes difficult to define, or it's underlain by continuum, or it's on that border between the objective world and the inner subjective world, things like color, and now here we have consciousness, we can see that sometimes it's a weak place where scientists who employ reductionism as a tool, generally in order to find out about the physical universe, might be tempted to invade, to simplify or obliterate the concept in various ways. And this has happened with personhood in at least 5 different ways. I already touched on Daniel Dennett's reductive approach to consciousness, which by extension eliminates personhood as well, because it probably depends on that to some extent. Then strict determinists can annihilate or transform beyond recognition the notion of personhood, such as Peter Strawson has done in Freedom and Resentment. Determinism means that free choice is an illusion, which in turn means that autonomy is an illusion, which means in turn that the Kantian notion of personhood is an illusion. So personhood then becomes merely the quality of being the sort of machine that has human-type social interactions. So I agree that one might be bound to this if you are an incompatibilist about scientific determinism. Some philosophers and even theologians, particularly in the East, might argue that a person is not the same one tomorrow as today. So Derek Parfit claims, for instance, that memory and psychological continuity, which are the province of just one individual, are the only things that give us any idea that that individual is the same at time t and time t plus 1. And so he largely throws it out for that reason. Now, I understand this argument, but I still think it's too skeptical, considering the success of our biological understanding of evolution and development, particularly, where organisms with an ontogeny, a lifetime, our personhood somehow flows from our organismic nature and is coincident with it. It co-manifests with it over time. So we have no reason to postulate a radical separation of personhood from organismal development. In my view, the more parsimonious explanation would be to keep the two together over time. Then those enamored with their own area of science might think that the aspect they study to be definitive of the human species or the human person. So for instance, those who understand the enormous influence that the genes have on the development of an organism might seek somehow to localize our personhood in the DNA. And there are many ways that biology can come to bear on this. The most immediate being that genes and environment, multiple environments, cooperate and interact to shape all traits, including human traits, through a developmental process. The genes can no more be the locus of personhood than the rules of tennis can win Wimbledon. Another even simpler way to refute it is to consider that identical twins share all of their DNA, but do not share personhood. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have many social scientists who would like to reduce personhood to cultural influences. So culture is, of course, enormously important, as is social learning in personal development, as is all social learning. But our culture is really a name for a bunch of other organisms in community, and all of our developmental processes are channeled not only by each other, but by other aspects of our environment, and then by internal inherited influences as well, and our own creativity. So we have to have a balanced view of genes, development, and environment as cooperators in the generation of all organisms, including persons. And persons and many organisms are subsequently even more than the sum of those parts by virtue of their own innovation on top of what has gone on before. So let's leave reductionism for the moment and consider briefly what would convince us that there were persons beyond the human and what those persons would be. Now, there are three main ideas here that I'd like to just touch on. One is that some philosophers and those involved with animal welfare, animal behavior, have suggested that the intelligence and complex social systems of certain animals should give them personhood status. Examples are chimps, gorillas, dolphins, and elephants, even ones that don't paint pictures. Biology would come to bear on this to the extent that we had a biologically sensible definition or criterion of personhood. At this point, the suggestion is more political and semantic than it is scientific. We are coming to understand the remarkable intelligence of animals, even though it's very often different from our own. But our commonly used criteria for personhood are still too vague to test, to admit of testing to see whether animals would fulfill it or not. And then those working on artificial intelligence and in some in the cognitive sciences think of rationality as thinking, which many do, and imagine that perhaps thinking is an emergent property of any high level of connectivity or information processing. And they would propose that computers and robots might eventually become conscious and thinking. And those at the Mind Project in the United States, for instance, have written, "We are convinced that one of the best ways to learn about minds and persons is to attempt to build an artificial person, to build a machine that has a mind and that deserves the moral status of personhood." Science fiction, of course, has been fascinated with this idea for decades, but not everyone involved in projects like this believe it's possible even in principle. But of course, there's a lot of speculation as to whether we could create something that would be living or thinking or conscious. Recently late philosopher Hilary Putnam notably offered a word of caution by suggesting that if a machine were sophisticated enough, we wouldn't even be able to determine whether it was conscious. Just an interesting idea. Dr. Ramachandra is going to be talking tomorrow on artificial intelligence and robotics here, so we can look forward to that. Now, speaking of areas of fascination for science fiction, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence always seems to be associated with a motivation not to just find any old life, but to find life that is intelligent, meaning essentially persons, those that communicate with us and interact as only persons can. Now, what are the ranges of traits in a completely, we could even use this as a thought experiment, what are the ranges of traits in a completely alien being over which we would consider personhood? How many of our own qualities as humans are we investing in our criteria that might not be present in other persons, and yet we would still consider them persons? In general, I think we're much too anthropocentric or anthropomorphic in our thinking about otherworldly organisms. They all look sort of like extreme versions of us. And our sample of one for highly intelligent life forms is probably to blame for that. I think number two could be vastly different from us. But I also think that it's a moot point, practically speaking, because of the distance one would have to travel. So I mentioned earlier that the explosion in references to personhood over the last 40 to 50 years arose largely because of the abortion issue. And the concept of personhood figured largely in those debates and still does today. They're not over with by any means. So I thought I would talk about this a little bit. Here's a poster from a recent workshop, for instance, that says, "When are we human? When are we a person?" And then a meme that went viral on the internet: "An egg, this is not a chicken. Acorn, this is not a tree. Silkworm, this is not a dress." And it's not even a zygote, is it? But nearly so. "This is not a person." And then on the bottom, "This is not a difficult concept." And then someone wrote back, although it got fewer hits, but still in the millions. "Inside an egg, this is a chicken. Inside a chrysalis, this is a butterfly. Rising out of the acorn, this is a tree." And then a fetus, "This is a human. This is not a difficult concept." So you can see, people are still, but notice, the beginning, "This is not a person," and then this one says, "This is a human." We are still largely equating the idea of personhood with the human being. That's not so strange, because in every dictionary that we commonly use, humans and persons are used interchangeably. I thought this was funny. While I was on the way over here, actually, this went into the papers. This is very recent. It refers to what is sometimes called the personhood movement currently underway in the United States, where arguments are being made that would, if successful, undermine the Supreme Court ruling that a fetus is not guaranteed a constitutional right to life because the fetus is not a person. So, first of all, we should recognize that personhood is not the only relevant thing here, and so we might want the answers to other questions as well, just speaking biologically and ethically. So when does life, or human being, or personhood begin? Now, because abortion is such an emotive issue, people sometimes don't want to separate these three things on either side of the debate, because their side might lose ground. But here's what I believe a biologist would say about these three questions if he or she were politically unbiased. So first of all, when does life begin? All life currently on the Earth, to our knowledge, began at the same time, about 3.8 billion years ago. And since then, there has been a continuous tree of life, many whose branches have never been broken, including all those that led to all of us in this room. And both the egg and the sperm that made each of our zygotes were alive. They were a haploid gamete form of the otherwise diploid Homo sapiens. If you look at plants outside in your gardens, you will see much more obvious gamete or haploid and diploid forms of a lot of plants. Some organisms live only in the haploid form. So okay, let's move on then. So when does a human being begin? An individual human being. This is likewise, I think, a simple question for a biologist. And remember that most people are using this as synonymous with person, even though as a philosophical definition of person and the concept of personhood, we can't be satisfied with that. But still, an individual human being began at some point during the process of fertilization, the formation of a zygote from an egg, which had several ingredients of the new individual, including half of the DNA and a lot of other things besides, plus the sperm, which had the other half of the DNA. When a new genome is formed, is a fair and typical place to consider the organism a new individual. It's certainly not identifiable with either the mother or father anymore. But one would have to note also biologically that the zygote is in no other respects more complicated or advanced than the egg and sperm that converged to generate it. And in fact, until gastrulation, right here, multiple individuals can still form from the different cells. So individuality is not guaranteed until 12 to 14 days. All right, so when does personhood begin? To this question, as you probably will gather from what I've said so far, despite all the political wrangling, we don't have a good answer for two reasons. One is that we don't really have a definition of personhood that allows us to empirically ascertain it. And the other is, even if we use typical criteria that we've discussed earlier, we have little understanding of fetal consciousness or self-awareness or thought beyond EEG patterns that seem to look human-like after about 28 weeks. In fact, what we know about the performance of infants and toddlers compared with chimps and other intelligent animals, to look for far advanced consciousness or self-awareness or rationality in fetuses of most ages would seem to be unpromising or even ethically misguided. So why is the debate largely centering on personhood then? And I think partly it's because of that dictionary problem. It's just being used as a synonym for the human being. And then also, as with many political issues that bear on biology, people are just ignoring the biology. And I'll give you some examples. So, well, first of all, here are the two sides of the political debate here. Personhood for all, no matter how small, from the personhood movement. And then here's a woman that has a card that says person pointing up at her and not a person pointing down to her womb. So first, in the UK, the Offences Against the Person Act is what makes many abortions, including poisoning oneself, illegal, implying that fetuses are persons. It's called the Offences Against the Person Act, right? But then the Abortion Act of 1967 makes exceptions to that still current act, such as that if performed by a medical practitioner before 24 weeks, an abortion is permissible. Which, of course, since English common law respects persons, that implies that a fetus is not a person. So we have an inconsistency there. Things are even worse in the United States. The Supreme Court ruled in 1973 that the unborn were not persons. Fair enough. But their reasoning was based on two things. One, nothing in the Constitution says that they are. That's reminiscent of creationism to me. You know, like if Genesis 1 doesn't say something, it can't be true. And number two, in the 19th century, laws didn't consider them to be persons. So since when are these authoritative sources for the question at hand? It also ruled that at the same time that when life begins is unknown, and so this is the official ruling, when life begins is unknown, and a fetus might only be potentially alive. All right, so obviously ignoring biology here. One of the two main US legal definitions of person is human being. The other is corporation right now. So US courts must therefore consider a fetus part of the mother. If you ever wondered why they consider it part of the mother when it's, of course, actually a distinct organism, because otherwise their only other option is to consider it a human being, and human being is equated with person. So there's sort of between a rock and a hard place there. So we end up with a false biological claim just by legal precedent, not by any actual research or knowledge on the subject. So in the US, a fetus is a person when it's born, no matter when that is, from 22 to 41 weeks. All right, enough with the negative. Let's ask something positive here. What's the best lesson our notion of the development of human personhood might gain from biology? Now here's a possibility. Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the architects of the new synthesis in evolutionary biology and a devout theist, writes this on when a fetus becomes a person. The wish felt by many people to pinpoint such a stage probably stems from the belief that a soul, conceived as a preternatural entity, descends upon a formerly soulless living stuff and suddenly transform the latter into human estate. I hope that modern theologians can accept the idea that the transformation is not sudden, but gradual. Developmental events are temporal processes. Even when we call them separate stages, they generally grade into one another. Now, I'm not implying a moral position here, or a definition of personhood, actually. I'm merely stating insights that we can gain from biology. It's likely, anyway, that a full ethic of human life would be based on much more than personhood, the way that we philosophically represented it. For instance, there's ample precedent in philosophy and theology for respect for pre-persons and post-persons. We don't eat meat of humans even after they're dead out of respect for what those humans used to be, the class of which they are a member. And likewise, human beings at stages before personhood, or whatever features we decide to be ethically most relevant, if it doesn't end up being personhood, should still be considered entities to be treated with respect. So, in other words, human beings at stages before personhood. So after all, we can agree that those entities are still on their way to becoming persons in the normal course of development. So here's a quote by Alfred North Whitehead. So as a parting note, I'd like to offer what I think we should do with this concept of personhood more generally, getting away from human ontogeny in particular. And our problem in getting an empirical handle on personhood, which is part of the reason for our debates on various things. So first, notice two things about this notion. One is, at least to many people, including in many official contexts, it has a normative definition. A person is the type of entity that we would never treat as a means, but only as an end, as an autonomous agent with the right to self-determination. And the second thing is that it is binary, meaning you either have personhood or you don't. Nobody seems to talk about partial persons or quasi-persons. And yet, to our best understanding, every criterion or capacity underlying personhood seems to be graded, a difference in degree, although the extent of the degree makes all the difference, it seems. So whether it's consciousness, self-awareness, rationality, creativity, intelligence, combinations of those. It's almost like an action potential of a neuron, where differences in degree in one respect, such as sodium flowing across a membrane, continues until you reach a threshold, at which time, boom, the electrical spike. But we don't know really to what degree personhood is like this. Our closest relatives and our ancestors are all extinct, and we know of no other life forms with anything like our levels of those criteria that we discussed earlier. And so in this situation, from a scientific perspective, with a sample size of 1, the precise nature of personhood and what qualifies one for it becomes rather ambiguous. So I would suggest that we would be better off leaving the concept of personhood as a theological or moral tipping point or threshold, and not a technical, empirical feature. Scientists should instead study, as they do, those criteria or underlying features. But one lesson from these is that since these ultimately person-making features appear to be on a continuum across living things, that means that we should accordingly recognize a gradient of moral responsibility to non-human living things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Plenty of food for thought there, so I'm sure there are questions. Who's on the microphone? Oh, Ruth, at the front here, please, Ruth. Please. There we are.
Thank you. You've dealt extensively with personality, but where does character come into the blend of what it is to be human, and when humanity first emerges in a fetus, for example?
Right. So the question is about character, and I assume you don't mean character as in prosopon, the original meaning of a person, but it was used for character back then, although character, that actual word, was also a Greek word that meant what I presume you mean, which is moral character, or the character, the moral personality of a human. So I did throw morality up there as one of the things that people have used as a hallmark of personhood. But most people don't use it for that for some reason. I was being purely descriptive there. I haven't even really interacted philosophically with these issues enough to know whether I would say that morality was a feature of a person, of all persons, but not definitive of it, or whether it is definitive of of personhood. Regardless, I think that what we have is we have persons, all of whom we would expect to have morality, because the normative definition assumes that. It's almost like a give and take thing. Since you have the ability to respect others, say, in community, then we have the responsibility to respect you. So I think morality is assumed. And then character in, say, an Thomistic or Aristotelian reading would be merely the moral personality of that particular person. So I think it is important. But as to when it arises in development, I think that is a gradual thing. And I don't know how much of it, certainly some of the substrate of it, since the brain is developing like gangbusters in the womb. But in terms of moral character, I have to imagine that is developing gradually over, most social psychologists would say, over the first 12 to 16 to 19 years of life. And I would hope that it develops over our entire life, actually.
Okay, let's move back, just Barbara, just a couple of rows behind.
Thank you. Have you done any studies on children's memories of being in the womb?
I certainly haven't, and I don't do empirical work in this area. But I don't know if anyone has done that except for fairly rudimentary studies, for instance, of movement. So trying to put some empirical flesh on this notion that is important in common law in the UK of quickening, of the first time in between 14 and 18 weeks that mothers experience movement in the womb. But there doesn't seem to be any dramatic philosophical conclusions we can make from those movements in particular. And the next thing that we see happening most often in cognitive science of fetal development is looking at the EEGs, the brain waves of fetuses, which appear much like humans, like you could recognize them as human at around 28 weeks, according to a recent 2013 paper. That's about as much as we can get.
There was a question over on this side. Laurie.
Part of the reason that the use of the term personhood dramatically rose in the 60s was the fallout from organ transplantation, when people had to decide whether you can discontinue life support in the newly emerging ICUs at the time. So this was an end-of-life discussion. Stanley Hauerwas wrote an essay at that point called "My Uncle Charlie Isn't Much of a Person, but He's Still My Uncle Charlie," arguing, in fact, for the definitions of personhood really not being important for these end-of-life discontinuation of life support discussions. So you've talked about the beginning of life, but so what do you make of this end-of-life skirmish about personhood?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. That was an oversight on my part. Actually, the largest contribution in the rise of personhood from the 60s through 2000 was not only the abortion issue. Because I was going to talk about that later, I got sidetracked on that a little bit, but it's right. It's this ontogenetic issue in general, the development issue of beginning of life and end of life issues, and when does personhood begin and end. And I think, the end of life issue actually arose somewhat before the beginning of life issue in the political consciousness anyway. So actually the vegetative state is often used in the literature as either a reductio ad absurdum argument for the notion of personhood as equated with a human being, because these people can't be persons because there's nothing going on in their heads, or at least in a thought experiment sort of vegetative state where there are no brainwaves, and we can be confident that the brainwaves that the mechanisms that we're using, the technology that we're using, is an accurate representation of what's actually going on in the brain. And those thought experiments do give one pause for thought, and you might be dealing with post-person human beings at that point. People have also talked about the possibility of resuscitation and what that would mean for this kind of thing, and there are examples, scattered examples of that. Of course, with the and then the value of people in those states have also been questioned. The Terry Schiavo recently situation, right? And so, what rights or do post persons have, essentially, would be the question there. But when the transition happens, I would say it would boil down again to this issue of us not knowing exactly what qualifies as a person. When you have many people in the United States considering person to be synonymous with human being, and you're basically saying that this person is not a human being anymore, then you can understand why somebody who might be coming at it from a more philosophical perspective and saying that a person is a rationally autonomous agent, it might be to some degree a semantic reason for the sort of emotive interchanges that we've been having. I'm not saying it's entirely semantic for sure, but yeah, it's definitely an issue that I have no ready answers for.
Could you say something about people like Peter Singer and the argument that a chimpanzee has more sort of moral considerability than a newborn baby, for example?
Right. So that's a great point. And so Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher, has championed animal liberation, as he calls it, which is pretty much animal rights, you could say. And if you are, as I suggested, if you are going to be consistent in your philosophy of what attributes rights to an individual organism, and you are only going to use particular neuroscientifically defined or cognitively defined capacities, and you're not going to think about potential, you're not going to think about species, you're just looking at what the animal can do, let's say intelligence, learning, then it is possible for one like Peter Singer to say that even infanticide, because a baby does not have, let's say mirror self-recognition is an indication of the most basic form of self-awareness. Babies before 14 to 18 months do not have mirror self-recognition, whereas adult chimps do. Therefore, if we want to consider that to be definitive of personhood, you can see where that's going to lead, right? And so we have to be careful if our morality is going to be involve a notion of the human being that's aside from this concept that is baldly empirical and neuroscientific and cognitive about personhood. So when he said that, I was, of course, taken aback. I'm like, oh my goodness, where are we going now when, at that point, a Princeton philosopher is saying that infanticide is preferable to killing a chimpanzee. And, but of course, I didn't have a rational basis myself for personhood, but I did not think that personhood was the be-all. I mean, it was rested entirely on current capacities. And so I think that that's the dangerous thing. If you rest your notion of personhood not on any membership in a class, not on any kind of understanding of what species it is, but on just current cognitive capacities as judged by a psychologist asking questions or testing against mirrors.
Let's move further back, Bob, and then we'll go to the other side.
Thank you very much. Can I pick you up on something you said right at the very end, that maybe we should leave these things to theologians? Maybe that's not what you said, maybe I'm paraphrasing, but it's clear that science is very good at describing things and how they behave, be they persons, which are a bit complicated, or cats, which are fairly complicated, or trees, or rocks, which are very simple. And we can look at the outside of them and describe how they behave in different circumstances. Can I just tease out this idea that maybe the status of human personhood is something that's imposed from outside? That would certainly be the Judeo-Christian view, that we're made in the image of God, whatever that means. Now, we discussed it a bit yesterday, but if that is the case, because God himself is not amenable to scientific study in the sense that we do scientific study on material things, then maybe what it means to be a person is not amenable to scientific study in the way we've been discussing, and you've certainly teased out many of the problems associated with it. So in a way, isn't it simpler if we say the status of a human being is imposed by God, because we're made in the image of God, and then we can work out how to look after people, particularly people that may be born severely brain damaged, and as far as we know, they can't have rational thought. And yet I've got a nephew like that, and you know, people have given their lives to caring for him for 18 years so far, and we, as humans, think that's a good thing. So can I tease out your views on this?
Yeah, so just as I mentioned yesterday that a purely biological understanding of morality gives us this sort of smattering of puzzle pieces, some of which actually don't fit into what we would consider morality. They just fit into human nature more generally in some respect, and some end up being, we choose to include them in this sort of sphere that we think of as morality. And yet we have to apply the rest of that sphere ourselves, even though we are a product of that very history. I would say that that is similar, although on a smaller scale, to what you're suggesting about personhood. And I think that that is very consistent with the way I think about science as illuminating part of the world, the full world. And in this case, our science is quite puny right now in terms of understanding self-awareness and rationality and creativity and intelligence and thinking and that sort of thing. And so we end up just getting little threads that we can't even put together in order to interpret what is personhood, because that scientific perspective on it is so weak, at least at this point. And I think it will always be too weak to nail it. And so it is probably, well, I'm not going to say probably, from the kind of worldview that a theist would have, the sphere of personhood is already formed. And what we're trying to do is figure out how it interdigitates with our scientific understanding. So it's already sort of a given. And today, in terms of biology and personhood, I was just trying to figure out how far on this sort of intercontinental railroad of understanding personhood we could get from the science side before we ended up meeting the theological and moral side of it, the imposition of personhood. And it turns out that we're still somewhere in New York City on the scientific end, and we're going to have to wait for the San Francisco line to get almost all the way to us before we can say anything, it seems. So.
Anthony, and then Vinos, and then we'll come forward.
Don't you think your views of personhood are somewhat colored by starting as a biologist? Because if you start as a theologian, you run into this problem of what happened when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. It's a very uncomfortable thing to have to deal with, because you realize that personhood can't then be a matter of physicality and corporeality, because if it's a matter of corporeality and physicality, then if the body dies, then it can't be reproduced. So surely, if you start out as a theologian, you're going to say that personhood, as Bob is saying, is actually a reflection of God. It's rather like the Shakespearean analogy. We go and watch a play by Shakespeare. If we forget that Iago and Othello are simply products of Shakespeare's mind, we tend to get wrapped up in what they're doing rather than, and we forget they actually come out of the same mind. So if we apply the same analogy to God, what we're actually experiencing from a theological point of view is personhood as a function of God's creation. So then all of a sudden, the argument becomes very different.
I guess I would say two things about that. One is that's a very interesting observation, and that's part of what I meant in my, I hope not too flippant statement at the end that we leave personhood to the moralists and the theologians, in terms of the scientists should, until we understand more of those personhood-making characteristics from a biological perspective. But then, what I've just said probably runs up against your second half of your comment, which is, the first half actually, which is the questioning the corporeality aspect to personhood, like why would cognitive science ever say anything about personhood or that kind of thing? Well, I would say that from a biological perspective, when in the Bible, when man lost his sight, which is a conscious experience, and Jesus healed it, we're talking about changing something corporeal and producing a conscious effect. And I would say that the restoration of personhood to Lazarus and even to Jesus could be seen as a similar kind of thing. It's a body-soul totality in Hebraic terms, rather than something that is entirely spiritual and imposed upon a body regardless. But anyway, these are things that we could talk about, but I by no means am a theologian, so I'm running roughshod over very delicate terrain here.
Well, let's let the theologian have the next question then.
No, I'm only an amateur theologian. Three quick comments. By the way, thank you very much for an interesting lecture. The limitations of science are not empirical, they're methodological. That science seeks to describe the world from a third person's point of view, the view from nowhere, describing the world as if I were not part of it. Whereas when we are speaking of consciousness, and particularly self-consciousness, it's the first person's view of the world. And that's why I'm very skeptical of scientific efforts to explain consciousness, because any theory of consciousness would also have to explain biology, rather than the other way around. How is it that we have these creatures who are seeking to understand their evolution? And that's the limitation. It's a methodological limitation.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, when it comes to severely deformed or defective persons, I mean, we would call a table that's broken a broken table. We don't call it something else. And I think we call severely defective persons still persons, but who are defective. They still have the basic infrastructure, if you like, the physical infrastructure, but it's not been developed, not been actualized for various reasons. But they still are persons, and therefore we respect them as persons, but in a certain unfulfilled state of development.
Yeah.
And the third comment I would make is that strictly Singer should be comparing a newborn infant with a newborn chimpanzee rather than the newborn infant with an adult chimpanzee, because the newborn infant is on a trajectory of personhood. Like I said, the infrastructure is there, but it is still in potential. It's not been developed. It's not a potential human being, a potential person, but a person at an infant stage of development.
Right. Yeah, so to start with the third one, I would agree that Peter Singer's view is only consistent when you ignore a whole bunch of things. And one thing that I did not mention that he has to ignore is development. So he has to think of every individual as being just what it is right now and has no future, no past, et cetera, no class to which it belongs. And of course, your second point, can you remind me what the... Yes. So, yeah, I hadn't thought of that before in those terms, but I think in other areas of philosophy, we very much do consider things to be sort of potential or unfulfilled versus the fulfilled or actualized. And I would say that in addition to this concept of ethically considering respect for pre- and post-persons, and the Vatican right now, for instance, in Roman Catholicism, is constructing an ethical sort of program or rubric for pre- and post-persons. We should also add to that this idea of the unfulfilled or unactualized person, whether it's temporarily or permanently. And then the first point again, I'm sorry.
Yes, whether a theory of consciousness is possible.
Oh, yes. So I would say that unfortunately, science, I would agree that it's methodological, but I would also say that it's necessary. So the fundamental nature of science, the way I see it, is that it's a self-correcting way of finding out about the universe. And so any way that is self-correcting, in other words, tells you when you have done something wrong, can qualify for science. And one of the ways that science can do that in community is that anyone in the world, if they have the capacity and the means, can test the same, and look for the same results that I found. Unfortunately, what that does is it makes science necessarily intersubjective and probably even objective, which is this third-person aspect that you're talking about, which de facto removes consciousness from the realm of scientific inquiry. Now, I don't know whether there is a way to get around that or a way that we can bump right up again, just shy of consciousness and teach us a little bit more about it than we know now. But right now, the outlook looks pretty bleak.
Okay, it's nearly coffee time, but there was a question somewhere. Was it you, Pauline? Just a really quick one. Is it a quick one? Can you use the microphone, Pauline, please? Thank you. Pauline. Yeah.
I was reminded, as you spoke, of something that John Paul II wrote, if I'm not mistaken, in the Mulieris Dignitatem. I know the Catholic Church emphasizes personhood right from the beginning of life, but he has this very interesting way of understanding personhood as something which develops later in life when one relates to others. So he does not interpret personhood as an individualistic thing, but rather as something which we develop as we relate with others. I'd like to get your take on that. And then, this is something that I think Dr. Ramachandra also referred to. How can you speak about personhood unless you also see it as something which is in potency? It's not something you're... It is something that you have a potency for it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to your opinion
Yeah.
on those.
So it's a lot of sense given the history of the use of that term in the church. And of course, it is fundamentally a theological term, person. Surprised to learn. So the Tertullian's idea of person was one being in three persons, and those three persons are in. And so personhood from its, or persona, from its very currently relational phenomenon. And then when it gets extended by the to humans, and then in Augustine and Boethius as well, it's also inherently relational because it's conveyed to us or bestowed upon us as a relational act from the original three persons. And so our imago Dei, our relationship to God, is an essential part of our personhood, or maybe even the fount of our personhood. Now, with respect to I just came to think of, and many secular and non-Catholic, even non-Christian thinkers also look at personhood as inherently relational. I mean, I'm coming from probably the most individualistic nation in the world. It's not surprising that I might overlook that and not highlight it and use it as one of my 4 instead of 3 criteria that are commonly used. But of course, I would say most people would consider humans to be inherently social beings, and so anything that would define us would probably have to include that sociality. And there are some biologists even who would think of this. Now, your second point again?
The impotency.
Oh yeah, yes, the potentiality. Yeah. So yeah, that is inherent in this idea often of the pre-person, not necessarily in Catholic theology, although it may be, but certainly in ethical arguments, even in secular ethical arguments, the idea of a person has to be taken in developmental context. We already saw what happens. Peter Singer's kind of view is what happens when you do not take development into consideration. So I would say what in a philosophical or theological realm you might consider to be the potentiality of the person. In the biological realm, we would say that it's taking development into consideration. It's taking becoming, not only current state of being into yeah.
Thank you very, very much, David. Unfortunately, we haven't time for more, but do grab David in the break if he had unanswered questions.
Thank you.